The flat top skull, the bolts through the neck, the slow dragging walk. Every detail that makes the Frankenstein monster iconic was already on screen in a German film 11 years before Universal shot a single frame. That film was called The Golem. It was from 1920, and almost no one outside of film school has heard of it. The Golem comes from one of the oldest stories in Jewish mysticism. Rabbi Lo of Prague shapes a giant man from the clay of a riverbank, inscribes a word for truth in Hebrew on its forehead, and breathes life into it to protect the Jewish ghetto from a royal decree of persecution. The story had been told for centuries before anyone put it on film. Paul Wegener first filmed the Golem story in 1915 and again in 1917. Both of those earlier versions are completely lost, which makes the 1920 film the only surviving chapter of his obsession with this character. He spent 5 years trying to get this monster right. For the 1920 version, Wegener brought in one of the most remarkable designers in German architecture. Hans Polzig, who had already built some of the most dramatic structures in Europe, agreed to construct the entire medieval Jewish ghetto of Prague on a Berlin soundstage. What he built did not look like a film set. It looked like a place that had been dreaming for 400 years. The walls leaned. The rooftops twisted. The streets curved in directions that streets should not curve. Critics at the time wrote more about Polzig's sets than about the story itself. This was German expressionism at full force, the idea that architecture could express the inner state of the people who lived inside it. And then there is the Golem himself. Wegener played the creature, which meant he had to act in the thing while also co-directing it. The costume added bulk to his frame. The headpiece gave the skull a flat and heavy top. The boots were enormous and loaded with weight. The overall silhouette was exactly the kind of silhouette that would show up in Universal's costume and makeup tests 11 years later. Whether Jack Pierce, the man who designed Frankenstein's monster look at Universal, ever consciously copied Wegener's design is something film historians still debate. Pierce said he based the flat head on his understanding of surgical technique. But the visual overlap between the two creatures is not subtle, and scholars have been noting it for decades. The plot of the 1920 film is a tragedy wearing the costume of a fantasy. The Golem is built to protect, and for a while it does. But then something shifts. It becomes possessive, unstable, dangerous to the very people it was made to serve. The creature built for protection becomes the thing everyone needs protecting from. There is a scene near the end that stays with you. A group of children are playing near the fallen Golem. One small girl, too young to understand what she is near, climbs up and pulls the amulet from the creature's chest. That amulet contains the magical word keeping the Golem alive, and the Golem simply falls, not killed, not destroyed. Just stopped gently by a child who had no idea what she was doing. The film was a major commercial success when it opened in Germany in 1920. American audiences saw it the following year, and US critics responded seriously. Several reviewers described it as the most visually ambitious fantasy film they had ever encountered. This was not a niche art piece. It was a genuine international event. Here is the historical weight that makes this film feel heavier now than it probably felt then. It was made in Weimar, Germany, 2 years after the collapse of the imperial government, in a country that was economically crushed and politically fractured. Anti-Semitic movements were already gaining ground. And to that moment, German filmmakers chose to tell a story about Jewish protective magic as something real, something necessary, something that worked. Paul Wegener kept working in German cinema through the 1930s and 1940s, which is its own complicated history. But the 1920 Golem survived him, survived the century, and is now firmly in the public domain. As a German silent film from 1920, it was never covered by valid US copyright, and any protection it might have held has long since expired. It is on the Internet Archive right now, in full, free to watch, in several restoration versions. You do not need to track down a print or navigate any licensing agreements. It is just there, a complete German expressionist horror film from 1920 waiting. What you get when you watch it is something genuinely strange and beautiful. The sets still hold up. The creature still has physical weight. And underneath the fantasy is a question that cinema has been asking ever since. What happens when the thing you built to protect you decides it wants something for itself? That question did not end with the Golem. It became Frankenstein and then Blade Runner and Westworld and 100 other versions of the same deep anxiety. But in cinema, it started here, with a clay man in a crooked medieval ghetto built on a Berlin soundstage in 1920 by a director so obsessed with a monster that he spent 5 years trying to get it right. If you want to keep finding the films that shaped everything else without ever getting credit for it, The Real Vault is where we do that. Every video goes deep into something real from the public domain that most people have never actually sat down and watched. Subscribe and we will find another one.